Hello, welcome to Gunpowder, Fiction and Plot. My name's Scott, and today I'm doing my wrap for all the books I read for Jane Austen July. Normally I post videos with my wife, but she didn't read anything from Jane Austen July, and she has been replaced with my dog Bryn, who has decided not to look at the camera. There he is. Bryn, look up. Say hello. No, just come across. Yeah, I didn't get that camera angle right, did I? Anyway, let's not distract you with pictures of my silly little dog, and let's talk about the books I read for Jane Austen July. Before I discuss that, I wanted to say what I thought of Jane Austen before I read these books. So Jane Austen and I had a complex relationship where basically I acknowledged her as a good writer who was important, but I personally didn't enjoy her. And I found this really frustrating because I can see why I should have enjoyed her, but I didn't. So I was sort of humming and hawing as to whether I should even join in with Jane Austen July, and I thought, don't say no to books. Don't say no to books. That's basically where I'm at. So I read some books for Jane Austen July. Now, let's go through the prompts, and I'll tell you what I read. So the first prompt is, read one of Jane's 6 main novels, and the novel I picked was Mansfield Park. And I'm pleased to say that I absolutely loved it. Mansfield Park, if you haven't read it, it follows a character called Fanny Price. Fanny Price is not orphaned, but basically sent to live with her cousins because her parents can't afford to look after her or something. And she's afforded the opportunities that may bring. And then it is a coming-of-age novel about Fanny and about Fanny's cousins and about a couple of people called the Crawfords, and it's a lovely, I want to say a love triangle, but it's kind of like a dodecahedron. Fanny is just such a wonderful character, and it was really the writing of this character that got me into Mansfield Park and got me to really love these books. She is essentially, she comes off as a very weak character, and she's not. But if you were being a lazy reader, or if you met her at a party or something, it would be really easy to believe that she was quite a weak-willed, easily manipulated character. She's desperate to please everybody. She wants people to think well of her, and she's just this like overly nice person, but you know that there's just that little bit more to her, and as she ages, it starts off and she's 10, but the main events of this book take place when she is 16. Maybe 15, I'm not 100%, but whatever, that sort of coming of age, debutante age, and you see her grow as a person throughout that book, and especially 15, 16-year-olds, they do change a lot in that period. They discover who they are, and we definitely get that with Fanny. It's a wonderful story. Fanny has a brother who she loves and likes to hang out with. She has a cousin, Edmund, who she loves and adores. And then the 2 characters, the Crawfords, come, and essentially Mrs. Crawford likes Edmund, her cousin. And one of the things I really liked in this novel is how Miss Crawford is nice to Fanny in order to win favour with Edmund. And that as she is being friendlier and friendlier with Fanny, she goes from being fakely friendly to get something to actually really liking her and actually, she is essentially one of the villains of this piece, and she almost gets an almost redemption story in this as she, because it's through the eyes of Fanny. And then the same thing happens with Mr. Crawford. As he gets to know Fanny, he likes her more and more. So I thoroughly loved this book. It is, in my opinion, it's the best work of Jane Austen I have read. And it's just pointed out what I sort of suspected about Jane Austen, that I was wrong about her, but it has encouraged me to go back and to read her novels. But what I will say is what I will ask rather is, if you're watching this, if you really liked Mansfield Park, what other Jane Austen book do you recommend? What's the most similar to Mansfield Park in your opinion? Because I'd like to give them all a shot again. I've read all of them except for Northanger Abbey, which sounds quite interesting, but definitely seems to be generally accepted as one of the weakest of the 6 novels. Anyway, let's go on with the next one. Read something by Jane Austen that is not one of her main 6 novels. And I read the novella Lady Susan. This is an episcatory novel, which means that it's written entirely in letters. And I didn't like this as much, but I'm completely know why I didn't like this. And I feel like if I reread this, I will have a different opinion of this. It's quite a short novel. It's very quick, and I spent quite a lot of the novel trying to figure out how people fit together and all that without actually enjoying what was happening and being said. I found I didn't think that the writing it in letters was, I didn't like that either. I think that that it would have been better as a book. And I also think that it's dangerous when you're reading works that the author never published. It's dangerous to judge the author on those. This is called Jane Austen's juvenilia because it was, probably written while she was a juvenile. She's practicing her craft. She's learning her craft. I think it's very dangerous to judge her work on these books. And if she never thought it was worthwhile publishing, then I think you probably have to be a big super fan of Jane Austen to read them and get a lot out of them. That said, there was definitely sparks in this book that made me think that it could be good. And I just struggled with how everybody interacted and how everybody fitted in with everybody else. And now that I've read that book, I think if I reread it, I would think higher of it. Which is potentially true with a lot of Jane's work. I suspect that Jane is exactly the author that you should reread. Because I suspect that some of the jokes she puts in early in the book you won't get until you've already read it, actually. So, yeah. Prompt number 3 is read a non-fiction work about Jane or about her times. Now, for this, I read a memoir of Jane Austen by James Edward Austen Lee. That is Jane Austen's nephew. I read this work. This work is credited with popularizing Jane Austen. Jane Austen was not particularly popular in her day and essentially gained popularity throughout her career. And this work was released, I think, 50 years after her death, just over 50 years after her death. And it is credited with really popularizing her to the extent that she is popular today in Victorian times. Now, I didn't expect to particularly enjoy this book. Non-fiction work written so long ago, I find dry, and I'm not happy with the level of research and the burden of proof and all of this sort of stuff. I don't enjoy non-fiction work that is written so long ago. And I didn't really expect to enjoy this book either, but I did expect to be curious as to what it was in this book that sparked the late Victorian fad that was Jane Austen. And I'm still wondering why this book, sorry, the dog's just barking at some cyclists that are going past our front window. Oh yeah, I have to say I'm still wondering why this book sparked interest in Jane Austen, and it wasn't her novels. It's a surprise to me. James Edward Austen Lee, nephew of Jane Austen, had met Jane Austen and had interacted with her, and I think he was quite old by the time he wrote this book. I think at some point he says he was older than 70 when he's writing this book, and that he was never going to write this book, but he was asked to write this book, so he did. I didn't really enjoy this book very much, and I wouldn't recommend reading it to learn about Jane Austen. I just don't think that it's got a lot in it. It was quite inconsistent in what it said, in that some of the stuff that he knew about her was not... I think that some of the stuff he didn't know and some of the stuff he did know, it just didn't feel right. He also corrected Jane Austen's political views and explained why she was wrong on certain political views at a time, and I didn't have time for that. I think that's a little bit shit. Yeah. Now the next prompt was read a retelling of a Jane Austen book, and I didn't do this prompt. So the next prompt is read a book by a contemporary of Jane Austen. And for this, I read a book called The Monk by Matthew Lewis. This was published in 1797, which was within Jane Austen's lifetime. She would have been about 20, late teens when it was published. This was an interesting book. It is based in Spain, and it's about a monk who is seen as a virtue, a really good figure and a figure to be upheld to. And he starts having lustful feelings towards women. He meets a demon that offers him power, and it's almost a Faustian novel about this man who is essentially a bishop in not a bishop, he's a monk in an abbey. It's a horror novel, but as an old horror novel, it doesn't actually read too much like a horror novel for me. In the sense, if you've read Dracula doesn't really feel that scary when you read that compared to modern day books. And this was 100 years before Dracula. So, is it a horror novel or not? To be honest, when I was reading this book, I was like, it's not that good. It's going to be a 2 or 3 stars. But the ending of this book, it just made it really good. And I ended up giving this book 4 stars. Very enjoyable book. But yeah, worthwhile reading this book through if you're not hating it, because it gets better. And it's considered a bit of a critique of, I considered it a bit of a critique of the church and the hypocrisy that exists with the ruling class, is how I saw a lot of things that happened there, and the hypocrisy that did exist in some elements of the church at the time. And so I found that it was quite... I found it a bit of a satire, and I hope that's how he intended it, because whenever I say that, I'm like, what if it wasn't a satire? That person must have been a real ass. But yeah. There were 2 other prompts for Jane Austen. Watch a direct screen adaptation of a Jane Austen book, and watch a modern screen adaptation or retelling of a Jane Austen book, and I didn't do these prompts either. So I found that this was quite a successful readathon for me. I love the fact that I had written off Jane Austen as an author that I was not interested in, and then I gave her one last shot, and I'd already given her one last shot a couple of years ago and said, no, that's not it. I gave her one last shot, and that has, actually made it for me. And I realised that I maybe need to go back and reread Pride and Prejudice and Emma and the other books that I didn't enjoy as much. So that's been a success for me. Jane Austen July was hosted by Katie at Books and Things and Marissa at Blatantly Bookish. If you haven't already checked out their channels, you probably should have by now, unless you're new to BookTube. But check out their channels. They're quality channels. So what did you participate in Jane Austen July? What was your favourite book you read for Jane Austen July? Did you have any surprises? Tell me what you think. And also, what do you recommend I read, having enjoyed Mansfield Park, having loved Fanny Price as my favourite Jane Austen character, and one of my favourite characters in any books, really. I love that it was so well written, that character. That she had to get that perfect to counteract the sort of internal strength and outside pliability. So having enjoyed Fanny Price as a character, what book do you recommend I read next from Jane Austen? Should I try Emma? Should I try Northanger Abbey? What would you do? Anyway, I've been Scott from Gunpowder, Fiction and Plot. I hope you're all reading something awesome. Bye.